Hi, this is your cameraman. We will be recording this for the fourth time because we had a number of emergencies.
Good morning. Welcome to week 5 of the introduction to cultural studies, and today's subject is the body. The body, of course, as perceived by culture rather than by biology, or perhaps somewhere in the middle, because if you think about it, the body is the threshold between nature and culture. It is both the product of natural evolution and the site of biological organs and all the biological functions, and also a very important area of social and cultural interaction. If we look at the body, this is definitely what we all humans have, and it is the site of our identity as human beings. It is both the source of the subjective self, so the interior perspective of our own mind, and the object of interaction with the objective material world, so the exterior. Of course, in terms of biology, in terms of evolution, we share a lot with other animals, especially the primates and large apes and mammals, but basically we share some characteristics with all life forms on Earth. One of such things that we share with animals, at least to some extent, is the way that we interact with the world through the senses. So the sense of sight, hearing, touch, smell, taste. This is our main gateway to understanding and interacting with the world. Animals sometimes have much more acute senses than humans, and sometimes they have some additional senses, like, bats that have the echolocation that humans do not. Definitely it wasn't our biological senses that made the humankind dominate the earth. It was rather our mental capacities and the culture. Because if we look at it, the body is the source of the most potent symbols in human cultures, all human cultures. If we look at religions, for example, all religions make references to the body because they operate at a very basic level of humanity. So all religions, we will talk about religions later on, so you will see if we talk of historical religions and those that are still present in the world, most of them are somehow related to the body. They have protective symbols, rites of passage, body modifications. They have all kinds of rules, sometimes very complex rules, concerning daily practices with the body, like food, clothing, sexual relations. So the body is the very important object of culture, even though it is rooted in nature. And this week, this is one of the topics that are quite controversial and potentially divisive. This is one of those big subjects that are still discussed in the academic world, especially in the humanities, and you may sometimes hear some elements of these heated debates which are very often politicized. We will talk about politics, and if you do not know what I mean, you will eventually get the gist of this. What I would like to tell you at this stage of our lecture course is that you have to bear in mind that the body is a sticky subject. So there are various obstacles to the study of the human body, and it may be, as the current popular dictum goes, quite triggering. We are going to talk about things like nudity and sexuality, illness, death potentially. So these are all subjects that many people react to emotionally quite strongly, subjects related to the body. If you are among such people, I recommend you take a break perhaps, you take some caution, perhaps do not watch it with some people you wouldn't like to share such information with, but still, I would encourage you to try to overcome your fear of certain aspects of culture and basically approach them and address them. Unless these are serious mental problems, then I would say seek professional help. So, what would be the obstacles to the study of the human body? First of all, religions. Again, the religious, especially the Puritan legacy. So the inhibitions and taboos against speaking about things like nudity or sexuality, illness, death. Many cultures consider these untouchable subjects, or subjects that should not be discussed by everybody. There are only specific groups of people that can even talk about such things. We will get to that eventually. The other very important obstacle is the dualistic models of culture. This is something that started to emerge in the Western culture in the 18th century during the Enlightenment. In the 19th century, it absolutely took center stage. It became ubiquitous. The dualistic models of culture, the tendency of intellectuals to perceive the world as binary oppositions. So biology, culture, body, spirit, feminine, masculine, health, illness. You could probably continue the list of binary oppositions, which over time has become the groundwork of humanistic treatment of biological matters, let's say. The current state of humanities, the postmodern humanities, try to undermine this dualistic model. They try to suggest that perhaps not everything is so black and white. This is one of the heated debates in the humanities right now, fought between the left and the right-wing intellectuals. We will talk about what is left-wing, what is right-wing later on, but this is like the philosophical groundwork of humanities. Whether the human world, the human perception is dualistic, or rather that these things like biology or culture or feminine, masculine, health, illness, they are on a spectrum, they are like a fan. So not two boxes, but a whole variety of different, let's say, shades of grey. The third possible obstacle to the study of the human body is the social construction, regulation and control of the body, including, very importantly, self-surveillance. So people are born into a specific culture, they are enculturated as children, and they are instructed in presenting their bodies and also looking at other bodies in a specific way. They internalize this knowledge so deeply that they become their own guardians. So most of you probably, if not all, are because of your prior education and upbringing, your own surveyors, your own guardians, because you have internalized the culture and cultural ideas concerning certain difficult topics, like the topics connected with the human body, to such a degree that you do not even think about it. It's in your nature, you might say. What I would like to show you now are two images from the 19th century, from the press in the 19th century. One is a press illustration, another one is a fashion plate. So if you remember from our discussion of fashion, an illustration from a magazine presenting what clothes are trendy at the moment. And what I would like to point to you is that bodies are bearers of social meaning. All bodies at all times, not only in the 19th century, but it's always a little bit easier if you have the benefit of hindsight. So if you can see something in perspective from the distance in time. So two examples, class and gender. Social class, of course, the 19th century, the Victorian society was obsessed with both class and gender. So the first image, the black and white image, shows two female figures. One is described as a lady and the other one as a woman. So the upper class lady, the rich lady, and the working class, poorer woman. Look at the figure, the shape of the body, the faces, the clothes, even the body posture of these two characters, and it tells you a lot about the Victorian perception of class expressed directly through the images of the human body. If we look at gender issues, the same thing. We'll talk about the difference between sex and gender in a moment. So generally, sex is biology, gender is culture. Gender is cultural expression of sex, let's say. So the biological difference. Here in this fashion plate we have a couple of fashionably dressed people, a man and a woman, and again, look at the differences in their presentation. The colors of the clothes that these two characters are wearing, the body posture, the man standing very upright and rather stiff, the woman hunched, stooped, in a body position that suggests that she is subservient perhaps to the man. If you look at the colors of the clothes, if you look at the shapes of the clothes, of course a woman wearing a very long skirt and the man wearing wearing trousers and the top hat, a very important indicator, not only of gender but also of class. This is not a working class man. This is a middle class man or perhaps an upper class man, but definitely not a worker. You can tell it by the clothes, especially by the hat. The woman is also closer to a lady than a woman from the previous image. So you can see so many types of cultural and symbolic information can be gathered from just images of human bodies. Human bodies wearing clothes and human bodies positioned in the world. Because there are very many aspects of human body that are significant. First of all, core cultural values are encoded in the body. Core cultural values are fundamental guiding beliefs and principles that dictate our behavior. Everybody has them. You have some sort of value system. Whether you are aware of this or not aware, you have it because you act like you do. Here you have a potential list of topics or questions that indicate what such core cultural values could be. So they could include religious belief. They could include the social values like family values, or things like the belief in honesty, or charity, or kindness, or sustainability, or perhaps innovation and progress, physical force as the source of power in the world, and perhaps again you could continue the list on your own, and perhaps you could answer in your own mind each of these questions. There are no good or bad answers, and there is a very large variety in all possible answers and combinations of answers especially. But if you think of any given culture from the historical perspective, from the geographical perspective, so synchronic and diachronic, if you remember from last week, each of these cultures would have a set of answers that they would see as correct, or as morally good, or as something that is worth propagating. Because cultures in general choose from the vast array of possible human behaviors and possible human belief systems, just some that each culture finds correct. Let's now look at two more aspects of cultural treatment of the body through the dimensions of time and space. So, if we have cultural use of space, we can talk about proxemics. If we have cultural use of time, we can talk about chronemics. And let's start with proxemics. It's quite easier. It's rather easy to imagine because it refers very directly to the material world. You have this graph here on the slide. This is the model presented by Edward T. Hall, and it shows the approximate distances that people use in social interaction. So imagine yourself standing in the middle of those concentric circles, and you have different proximities, this proxemics, yes, that delineate your interaction with other people on the grounds of how close you feel to these people. So the most intimate circle, the red circle here, is the circle that denotes the intimate distance, which in most cultures is reserved only for those people who are absolutely the closest to you. So this is the kind of distance that allows people to embrace easily. So basically they can have full body contact very easily if they choose. This is something that is usually shared by lovers or by parents towards their children. This means very close, intimate contact with another human being. Then we have personal distance, indicated here by this orange circle, which is reserved for friends and relatives, so people you are close with, but not really on intimate terms. This is the distance that allows you to touch the other person easily, especially if there is the mutual will to touch. So if you want to shake hands with somebody, if you want to touch somebody, I don't know, pat them on the shoulder, or communicate other non-verbal signs by touching, this is the personal distance that people use. The third one, here marked by the green circle, is the social distance. This is something for acquaintances, something for people that you feel relatively safe with, but not quite completely at ease. So people you know, people you trust, but you wouldn't really go touching them all at once. So it is a rather comfortable social distance that people use in generally understood social situations. So if there is a larger group of acquaintances, if these are people you are not really on personal terms yet, but you feel you might advance to friendship, that's the social distance. The last one, the public distance, here marked by this blue circle, is the distance for strangers. The distance, for example, for public speaking. So you can only communicate through voice. There wouldn't be any possibility of touching, even if both parties wanted to touch suddenly. So that's something I'm doing now. I'm communicating with you through the voice, even if we are not in the same place. So if we were in the lecture room, we would be using we would be using public distance, probably. So me somewhere with the microphone and you sitting. Of course, this is not very complete image of proxemics. There are cultural differences and there are personal preferences here at play. And usually, if we talk about body issues, it's always the discussion between your personal or somebody's personal preference and cultural difference. So, personal preferences are easy. There are some people who are extrovert, they want to touch their acquaintances, they kiss when they greet, so they are kind of touchy people. You probably know such people, and maybe you are one of them yourself. There is also quite a number of introvert people who are more reserved. They could be friendly and they could be very willing to maintain social contact, but they are not really that touchy. This applies to the personal level. On the cultural level, there are entire cultures that favor, let's say, high and low contact. Traditionally or stereotypically, we'll talk about stereotypes in a moment, Southern cultures, like Mediterranean or Latino cultures, they are traditionally quite high on contact. So people stand close to one another, they touch frequently on in social interaction. And there are other cultures, like, for example, Scandinavian cultures, which are more reserved and where people usually stand at a greater distance and do not interact so freely with strangers and, let's say, distant acquaintances. So that's proxemics. The next thing is chronemics, that is the cultural use of time. It is a bit more complex because time is not a visible thing, it's more abstract, so it requires a bit more abstract thinking. But we can try to do a similar comparison in regards to time. So generally, people perceive time in two ways. First, as a linear sequence of events. So, for example, people are born, they go through childhood, they go through youth, they go through adult age, then they age, and finally they die. It's a linear process, nothing can be done about it. The time moves forward. There is also the cyclical concept of time. If you look at the seasons of the year, for example, they come in cycles. If you look at the weekly cycle of your work or studies, you have the same class, the same type of class every week. So there are like little cycles every week with the timetable and the weekend at the end. There are also biological cycles, like the cycle of menstruation, which also happens in cycles. There is a concept that unites these two ideas, the oscillating time. So it's like the little circles gradually moving forward. So it is possible to combine the linear and the cyclical time. Also, you can talk about the personal preferences again. So there are some people who can only focus on one thing at a time. They are sometimes called monochronic people. People who do one thing at a time. There are others who are more polychronic. It means they like to multitask. They do many things at the same time, or at least they try to. This is, again, the matter of personal preference, which could be different for each person, really based on their personality and temperament. There are, however, cultural indications here as well. So, some cultures have the future orientation. They are all about progress. I would say that the Western culture in which we live in is very much future oriented. It's all about the linear progress. Some cultures, historically or even presently, are more oriented towards the present, towards the maintaining of, let's say, traditional cycles. Chinese culture, Indian culture are quite known for such orientation in time. The last thing, think of the importance of time measuring devices. All the clocks and other forms of measuring time, how it changed culture, how it changed human interaction with culture. Things like the popularization of railways and the timetables. So now if you want to go somewhere from one place to another, you need to be at the station at a very specific point in time. If you don't care and come, let's say, an hour later because you've never really cared for watches, you might lose your connection and the whole plan will fall over. So it's sometimes called the chronophilia of modern culture and Western culture, which means that our culture is obsessed with measuring time and living with the clock. What do you think of that? So let's continue in a moment. So let's continue. The next two concepts I would like to introduce to you are the concepts of the archetype and the stereotype. And they can be applied to many things. In this case, because we are still talking about the body, they will be applied to the aesthetic ideal of the body, in this case a female body. And I hope to show you the difference between the archetype and the stereotype. So the archetype, the concept of the archetype comes from ancient philosophy, from Plato, for whom archetypes were pure forms that embody fundamental characteristics of something. It could be material objects, like, I don't know, tables. You think a table. You probably have some sort of mental image in your head or something that you can imagine a table to be. But if you think about that, these could be a lot of different objects made of different materials, different sizes, different shapes, different number of legs, different functions even, because you can have a writing table or a working table or a dining table. But you somehow know what a table is when you hear the name. So there must be, this is what Plato believed, some sort of ideal to which all those individual, very varied manifestations refer. And this ideal, for Plato, would be called the archetype. So if you think of a beautiful female body, you have, for example, the archetype of the goddess Aphrodite or goddess Venus, as seen here in the classical painting by an Italian painter, Giorgione. So a sort of prototype, a sort of model that other things of the same category copy. This is something that we'll return to probably more than once. We'll definitely return to when we talk about religions, then we'll return to when we talk about mythology and narration, because the archetypes are still very powerful culturally. They are similar to memes. Remember the memes? The units of information, but archetypes are very, 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 and I mean really very ancient memes. The memes that refer to something as old as humanity itself. So they constantly recur. So you have different manifestations of the archetypes as symbols or motives in mythology, literature, art, and basically stories that people tell themselves. So it still makes them interesting, especially from the point of view of literature and culture studies. However, it's one of those tricky topics. This is one of those big discussions. If you remember, at some earlier point, I told you about this very, very simplistic division into the side of Marx and the side of Freud. So the material reality versus the human mind. This is Freud territory. This is the human mind. And the scholar who was basically obsessed with archetypes throughout his long career was the student of Freud, Carl Gustav Jung, and what he postulated was what he called the collective unconscious. He believed that archetypes are collectively inherited and universally present. So basically, by the function of being human, people share a basic set of fundamental images which constantly recur in culture, which recur in individual lives through dreams, for example, or fantasies. They recur in mythologies, and this is just a quite limited set of archetypal images, which again are unconscious. They are inherited from previous generations or somehow transmitted from previous generations, and they are universal. So all people have them, according to Jung. We will return to this. There are some problems with this theory, but especially if you study culture and literature, this may be relevant, even for the sheer number of constantly recurrent themes. The stereotype, on the other hand, is an overgeneralized belief about a group of people. So, if we take our example of a beautiful woman, that's the stereotype. A pin-up girl, an image of a pin-up girl. So she shares some characteristics with the Sleeping Venus of Giorgione. She is young, she is white, she is slim. The image shows her naked, or in this case, nearly naked. She is sexualized, but it's not really a recurrent prototype, but an overgeneralization. An overgeneralization referring to a group of people. In this case, young women, perhaps. Young, pretty women, maybe. or whatever culture considers pretty. So why stereotypes are formed, it's a very basic human mental capacity, which again goes very, very far back in the evolution of the human mind, to the situations in which you have contact with a certain unknown person. You approach a human being you have never seen before, and you have to identify this person very quickly in terms of friend or foe. Do I run? Do I fight? Do I try to approach this person because it may be useful or pleasant to do that? So usually these stereotypes were developing to allow such very quick decisions based on external characteristics of a group. So the problem with them is that they are very rarely applicable to individual people. There is usually a grain of truth in them. This is how they are formed. They are not entirely false. There is a grain of truth, but it's elaborated upon, it's simplified, and it's made into a kind of black and white, very quickly identifiable logo, basically, not even a kind of nuanced image. So everybody has them. Everybody. It's just a feature of the human mind that you acquire by being brought up in a given culture. So everyone has stereotypes. I would say the best thing you can do is actually try to be aware that you have them and try to catch yourself when you start thinking in stereotypes. Because, as I said, they are not very truthful about groups. So it's not like there is a grain of truth, but a lot of lies or a lot of exaggeration built up on it. And in case of individual people, they are even less applicable. They usually encourage prejudice, and it's usually based on some sort of external characteristics that a person in question has nothing to do about, like skin color or ethnicity or I don't know, language or age or just you name. If anything can be made into a group characteristics, it can be made into a stereotype. So that's it. Now another very tricky and divisive thing: sex and gender. So basically speaking, sex is the biological difference, the difference between male and female organisms. It is based on their anatomical structure, on their reproductive systems, on their chromosomal build. And this is something that you cannot choose, that you cannot really change. This is something completely beyond your control. This is purely biology. However, and this is the trick, and humanity is really thrive on little however. So however, most people are just assigned sex at birth. So a child is born, the doctors usually do not bother with checking the chromosomes or something. They just look at the genitals of the newborn baby and decide this is the boy and this is the girl. Sometimes they cannot quite say, And this is the problem, because still they usually have to assign sex at birth, because there are just two boxes. And what with the situation if somebody doesn't fit into the box? I would say there's something wrong with the boxes then, but we'll return to this in a moment. So sex is biology. There are, of course, some people who are not happy. So their, let's say, mental perception of their sex is different than the sex they were assigned at birth. Luckily for us, medicine is able to help such people now, and still, as you probably know, it is a heated philosophical and cultural debate. Again, we may end up returning to this later. Now let's move on to the category of gender. Gender means simply social roles ascribed to sex. They can be imposed, for example, by the law that prescribes that, for example, like in Saudi Arabia, women cannot drive cars. This is the law. So this is nothing to do with sex. It is the social role ascribed to the female sex, by the law in this case. Or usually, like in our culture, usually internalized. So again, self-surveillance. People who are born in a culture and they are enculturated in a given culture, they grow up accepting certain behaviors as typical for their assigned sex. So something is considered feminine, something is considered masculine. The clear example, like why this is culture and not nature, is to see that gender roles are different historically and geographically. There are some cultures in which, I don't know, men were given custody to children in case of separation of parents. We'll talk about it when we talk about family. So it has nothing to do with biology. It's just cultural gender roles. Here we have an old advertisement of beer, actually. The original version and the modern, quite ironically reworked version. The same text, "Don't worry darling, you didn't burn the beer." In the original version, we have a woman crying and quite distressed, and a man wearing the suit, so probably he has just returned from work. The woman was supposed to make dinner. She burned the food accidentally, but the man says, "Don't worry, darling, you didn't burn the beer, so we won't have dinner. Don't worry, we'll just have a beer instead." This is a silly little ad, which could be seen as quite harmless, but I want you to see how much it works on gender stereotypes. So the social roles ascribed to sex. And it's especially visible in the reversed roles. So we have a woman wearing a suit and probably working outside of the home, and the man wearing an apron and being distressed because he burned the food. And the woman says, "Don't worry, darling, you didn't burn the beer." So the same situation. A kind of understanding, nice partner who says, "Okay, you had an accident in the kitchen, you burned the food. Don't worry, I don't mind, we'll just have a beer instead." But why is the reworked version amusing, at least to most people? Is because it reverses the implied gender roles. It reverses the implied gender stereotype that it's the men who work outside of home and the women who stay in the home and prepare food. So we have all these things really working together. Let me now tell you a story. It's a very sad story about a little boy from the 1960s. He was born in 1965. And his tragic story really proves that sex and gender are not as fluid as you might sometimes wish they would be. So this is a story of one of the twin boys, who were born in America in 1965 in a very regular home. And the woman gave birth to twin boys. And if you know anything about America and the treatment of babies in America, it used to be absolutely commonplace for little baby boys to be circumcised. It's a religious practice, a type of bodily mutilation, we'll talk about it, which was used almost on all little baby boys born in America for most of the 20th century. Even if they were not from Jewish families, there were some sort of hazy medical explanations given to it. Anyway, the parents had nothing really to say. The doctors would routinely circumcise all the little boys. But, unfortunately, in case of little David Reimer, there was a horrible accident when this procedure was performed, and his penis was basically cut off. So there was this little boy, aged a few days, so a tiny baby who wouldn't remember a thing, with a completely damaged set of genitals. The parents were devastated and shocked and desperate. The doctors were devastated too, and they really regretted this horrible accident, and they tried to do something to help this unfortunate child. They called a very respected psychologist and sexologist called John Money, Dr. John Money, and he believed that the best thing to do for this child was to let him be brought up as a girl. So he advised the parents not to say anything to their son, just to raise the twins as brother and sister rather than two brothers. When David reached puberty, he would be given hormonal treatment, he would be given some surgical treatment to make his body look a bit more like a girl. And basically the idea was that at such young age he can be enculturated into believing that he is a girl. He can be brought up to behave in a feminine way and basically to become a functioning woman. Of course, infertile, he wouldn't be able to have children, but he would be a functioning woman. Unfortunately, this proved to be very wrong, especially for David, who, even when he was treated as a girl and nobody told him anything about it, he knew in his mind that there was something deeply wrong with his body, with his life, so much so that he started self-harming, taking drugs, and basically doing all kinds of dangerous things. So the parents finally decided to tell him what happened, and together with the doctors they decided to try to reverse the entire process. So they took him off the hormones, they did some surgery on him, trying to make him back into the boy. He was reassigned as male, so his name went back to David, the original name that the parents chose for him. But unfortunately, this didn't help in the long run, and David developed very severe depression and ultimately committed suicide as an adult, but still a relatively young man. In fact, the entire family suffered tremendously, and his brother also, I think, took to drugs and had several very deep psychological problems. So what this sad story tells you is that gender is not completely fluid. There is a connection. There is some sort of deep connection between sex and gender. And for the majority of people, of course, their gender corresponds to the biological sex they were assigned at birth. And even if such horrible tragedy would happen, it wouldn't change the way they feel. Even if everybody in the world tried to convince them they were the other sex and gender. So it didn't really work. Next thing when we that we have here is some names of scholars and psychologists from the second half of the 20th century who are working on the ways that humans interact through language. So human interaction through speech, through language. And one of the first of such scholars was the man called John Austin, who was active mostly in the first half of the 20th century, and he noticed that sometimes things that people say change the world. The title of his most famous book, How to Do Things with Words. So you can actually do things with words. For example, if you promise something, it changes the world. It kind of, you assume as if you're going to get something. Or if a marriage ceremony is conducted, so somebody like an official or a priest say you are now husband and wife, it changes the reality. You start behaving differently. You start interacting in the society in a different way. So sometimes words create reality rather than just describe it. Then John Searle, we have the theory of speech acts, which means that language assigns social roles to people. For example, nominations. In few years' time, when you hopefully reach the level of the BA and then the MA, you will be given the title of the BA and hopefully your life will change for the better. Then possibly you'll get the title of an MA and your interaction with the world will change. Then again, you may get some other nominations in your professional life, for example, and every time such speech acts, so things we do with words, change reality. This led the very influential scholar called Richard Rorty to write that we have experienced something that he called the linguistic turn. It is that, in his opinion, reality is accessible to humans only through language. Think about that. So, for Rorty, it is the language that allows us to interact with reality. We wouldn't be able to understand the world without our ability to speak. This seems like kind of philosophical question, but it has some real life implications, and we'll talk about it in a little moment. Another way of looking at it by Erving Goffman, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, that's the title of his book. Theatrical performances in face-to-face interactions. So the way that people interact through language is basically by playing roles. Many writers in philosophy and psychology have tried to unpack this theory or to polemize with this theory. This is one of the big philosophical discussions of the late 20th century. Do we use the language to describe the world or to create the world? And we continue in a moment. And the last part for today, I would like to focus on feminism and the history of women's rights and feminist philosophy. You are definitely going to meet these people virtually. Perhaps you'll be able to meet some of them in person. Some of them are still alive. Later on in your studies. So if these names are completely new to you, don't worry. It's just to familiarize you with them and their most important work and most important ideas. If you know them already, I strongly encourage you to go further, to perhaps read some more, read some of those books if you haven't read them, to do a Google search at least or something, so you can develop on what you know already. So we finished with the theory of speech acts and the way that according to postmodernist philosophy and scholarship, humans interact with the world through language and only through language. And this brings us to a very important modern or postmodern contemporary philosopher called Judith Butler and her theory of gender performativity. So this links together the linguistic turn with the theory of gender. Her most important book is from 1990 called Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity. And what she believes is that biological sex may or may not be the basis of one's identity. So, roughly speaking, a child is born into the world, they are assigned sex at birth, based usually on the observation by the doctors. And then what happens is that the entire culture works very hard to enculturate the child into growing into a girl and a woman, or a boy and later a man. So gender is gender meaning, as you remember, social roles ascribed to sex. So the way that people present themselves in the world as men or women. It is a kind of performance. So when you are enculturated, when you are growing up, the culture, meaning your parents, your peers, your friends, social institutions like school or preschool or all other social interactions that you have, literature, culture, the films you watch, the games you play, they instruct you more or less deliberately, but even if they are nominally about something else, they instruct you how to be a man or a woman. So how to behave, how to perform, like at the theater, the role of a man or a woman. And here we have, on the slide, we have the illustration showing two teenagers, a boy and a girl, both with computers, and you can see very similar body postures, very similar facial expressions, but there are visible changes, and probably, I would say, most of you wouldn't really hesitate to say which of these teenagers is a boy and which is a girl. Because of the clothes, because of the hairstyles, because of the color coding, because of the decorations to their computer frames. So there is nothing especially feminine about the color pink or something masculine about the color blue. It's purely cultural. In fact, it changes in time. Actually, in the 19th century, pink was seen as more of a boyish color and blue as a girlish color. So it's completely arbitrary. There are usually some sort of hazy declarations, or explanations why it is so, but it's arbitrary. Believe me, it's just somebody decides. Okay, let's now assume that the color pink is girlish and color blue is boyish. This is really pure culture. So the way that culture teaches children to behave in a gendered world. And the next slide shows you a little cookie in the shape of a human, the genderbread person. So it's like a gingerbread cookie, but this time it's about gender. This is from an educational website. This is basically aimed at I think primary school children, but I think if you are not very familiar with these concepts, this is a way of introducing them in a relatively simple manner, if a little bit simplified. So if you are beyond that stage, good for you, read something more, read something a bit more advanced. If this is, let's say, the first time you hear about it, or the first time you hear about it in a, let's say, culturally neutral environment rather than political discussions. This is what the whole cultural thing about gender is about. So we have this cookie person here with four little scales. So these are all the categories. The category of gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, and sexual orientation. So gender identity, it's in the brain. So it's marked to the cookie person's brain. So how you feel in your mind about your gender. Do you perceive yourself as a man or as a woman? This is a very dualistic view, but of course here it is suggested in each of the four cases that it's not really an either or, it's not really a black and white two boxes thing, because there are some people who are in the middle, who are somewhere in the middle. If they are exactly in the middle, they might be referred to as gender queer. But perhaps there are some people whose identity is fluctuating, or they do not really like this kind of duality at all, and they perceive themselves more like a kind of general human than a gendered human. So they are definitely not easily put into one of the boxes, woman or man. So it is a kind of spectrum, and according to the postmodern philosophy and psychology, most people are somewhere on the spectrum, and the whole idea of having two boxes for everything is wrong for one reason. If you want to have a theory that includes absolutely everybody, you can disprove it by finding even one argument, one example against it. If it's supposed to include everybody, if there are people who fall off the net, who fall through the net, who do not fit in either of the boxes, it means one thing: there is something wrong with the boxes. Perhaps these are not boxes, perhaps it's a kind of fun, a kind of line with all the points in between the two extremities. Of course, for most people in the world, they will be somewhere close to one of the extremities. But because it's not for everybody, the spectrum theory is probably more relevant, because it actually allows everybody, or at least more people than before, to situate themselves somewhere on the scale. The other category is gender expression, and this is this kind of wavy line around the body of this cookie human. So the feminine or masculine expression. Expression meaning basically what Judith Butler would call performativity. How you dress, what is your favorite hairstyle, what is your favorite way of, I don't know, interacting with the world, the hobbies, the interests, and how you present to the world, how you perform to the world, Judith Butler would say. So most people perform as either feminine or masculine. But then again, not everybody is at the end of the scale. There are lots of people who feel very comfortable in between, as androgynous in the choices of clothing, in the choices of accessories, in their behaviors, and why not? It's part of the spectrum of human behaviors, even regarding the gender roles. So then again, not perhaps the two boxes, but rather a kind of scale. Then we have biological sex. So here, the genital region of the cookie person. Female or male. But again, what about those people with, I would say, rare cases of chromosome sets? There are people, it's usually, as you know, XX for female, XY for male. What about different variations that are not XX or XY? You can Google that. There is a variety, there are like 20 or more probably, different possibilities, rare possibilities, very rare, of different sets of chromosomes that people may have. So, how do you decide whether they are male or female? Sometimes you cannot decide at all, even by looking at the sets of genitals of the baby. Such people would be called intersex. But if doctors really get puzzled and they start looking at the chromosomes, they may find out something different, something that doesn't fit into the box. And of course, these are very rare cases. They have existed as long as humanity, probably. But in historical perspective, they were either seen as aberrations or some sort of illnesses. But for many people, it doesn't really make their life considerably harder. So why treat it as an illness if they do not feel ill? Or it was just brushed under the carpet and nobody cared. You were assigned sex at birth and deal with it. Sometimes the doctors didn't guess correctly and your problem, not theirs. So even in this very dualistic image of biological sex, there are the cases in the middle. So again, two boxes are not enough. It's more like a spectrum, or perhaps a spectrum made with dots of possibilities, with the vast majority of people on either end of the spectrum. But some, and in the global perspective, it would be probably thousands, if not millions of people falling into the middle category. The last category here is sexual orientation, that is who you are attracted to, if at all. There are some people who are not attracted to anyone, they would be asexual. There is also the romantic orientation, so some people just want some sort of emotional connection with another human being and not necessarily sexual connection. It's all quite complex, but to make it again simplified for school children, the usual division is heterosexual versus homosexual. So you are attracted to the opposite sex or to the same sex as yours, with some people in the middle who are attracted to anybody. So basically, both the same and the other sex. This is very simplistic, and the main idea behind this image is basically to show you that the dualistic view of the world is not sufficient to describe the world correctly, to describe the world fairly. Because if you have a dualistic set, so two boxes, you disprove it by finding one example that doesn't fit into either. And you have lots of examples like that. And the last subsection today is the very, very brief history of feminism. So the first three waves, the first wave, the 19th century, the suffragettes, if you recall this name. So the fight for women's rights, for women's right to vote. Suffrage means the right to vote. It was finally given to British women after the First World War in 1918. And so after several decades of campaigning and political activism, the first wave of feminism in the 19th century, or even slightly earlier, we'll talk about it in a moment, from the Enlightenment period onwards, was about educational equality, access to professions such as medicine or the law. They did not accept women students, and there were no female doctors or female lawyers. Actually, before 1870, there were no women admitted to university. You wouldn't be able to study here if you're a woman, say nothing about lecturing. So that's the first wave. The second wave was in the 1960s, on the wave of the kind of youth revolution in the after Second World War. Europe, they were mostly campaigning for social equality, such as equal pay for equal jobs, and also things like cultural sexism, gender stereotypes, discrimination at workplace. So this was the first generation of women that didn't like those old advertisements, like the one with the woman burning the dinner and the man saying, "Don't worry, you didn't burn the beer." So the assumed idea that women are supposed to stay at home and be homemakers, and it's the man's role in the society to go out and be professionally active, and if a woman wanted to work, she would be paid less than a man because he had a family and she probably didn't. So that was the second wave. The third wave, which started in the 1990s, was mostly focused on the reproductive rights of women, so abortion rights, of course, but also other things concerning reproductive rights, such as the access to contraception, which prevents abortions, if you think about that, or the maternity rights for women who have children. So if you think about one of the greatest inventions of the modern world, it's very often said that it was the contraceptive pill, which gave women the right to decide whether or not to have children, or when to have children, and how many to have. This was a complete change of perspective on gender roles, on sexuality. We'll definitely return to this next week when we talk about family and cultural perspectives on family. But this is something that's very visible in the second wave of feminism, and especially in the third wave. Also, the so-called intersectionality, it's still a hotly disputed topic. So something that's sometimes called the layers of oppression. So class, race, health, different areas, different groups that people may belong to. So not only women's rights, but let's say the connection between femininity and social class, or femininity and race, or femininity and health, for example. So intersections, which means kind of crossing points. And here in the next slide you see the caricatures of feminists from the first, second and third wave, and it's always been like that. If women want their rights, they would be ridiculed, they would be presented as unfeminine and ugly and unattractive and too loud and too violent and whatever else. As you can see here, a postcard from the beginning of the 20th century, a press drawing from the second wave, and a relatively recent meme showing some unfortunate woman with the caption "Feminism is ugly." Like, who says that? So that's unfortunately the social truth, that if you have a group that is not privileged and they just want equality, they will be met with some derision and ridicule, and we'll definitely talk about it some more when we talk about modernity and politics. It's just now to give you the first idea about what culture can do with the human body. So let's continue our discussion of some feminist thinkers from the different historical moments from the 19th century onwards. And the first one, she actually died before 19th century came, was Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft, wife of philosopher William Godwin, mother of writer, novelist Mary Shelley, the one who wrote Frankenstein. That's her mother. Unfortunately, she died giving birth to Mary, so Mary Shelley never knew her mother. She only knew her from her writings, because she was a published author and quite a philosopher in her own right. And her most important publication was called A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And this was a very enlightenment-inspired essay about the need for women's education. Mary Wollstonecraft believed that women should get education on the same grounds as men, and not only for the pleasure and benefit of men. This is something that was postulated earlier by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who believed that of course women should be educated, girls should get education because it makes them better wives and mothers. Mary Wollstonecraft believed that women should become valuable members of the society and not just ornament to it as pets or toys, as she wrote. And it is the culture that makes them stupid, because it denies them the right of education, it denies them the opportunity to develop their talents, and basically focuses them on the home and marriage and child rearing, and that's all that culture then had to offer women. Then in the 19th century, in the Victorian period, we have a husband and wife team working together. He was a politician and liberal philosopher, John Stuart Mill. Her name was Harriet Taylor, and together they wrote a book called The Subjection of Women, published in 1869, with only his name on the cover, because he was a well-respected philosopher and a member of parliament. She was just his wife. So, but he was, you might say he was a feminist as well. He was definitely a very vocal ally of women's rights. He believed that women's situation in the society, and we are talking about Victorian society in the 19th century, was compared to slavery. Why? Because of social prejudice, the limited access to education, the legal side of marriage, so the fact that a married woman basically lost all her rights as a citizen. So John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor strongly believed that women should get equal political rights. They didn't live to see the suffrage given to women, but there were some changes that they inspired, like some legal changes in the second half of the 19th century, like the Matrimonial Causes Act or the Married Women's Property Act, which improved the legal protection of women in marriage. So we'll talk about it next week when we talk about family. We are moving into the 20th century. One of the very important feminist philosophers of the first half of the 20th century, French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir, and her most important book called The Second Sex, published in 1949. And here is the most famous quote from this book. It's still relevant, it's still very interesting. If you have a chance of reading that, absolutely go ahead and read it. It's still quite relevant. The quote, "One is not born a woman, but becomes one." So this is, I would say, quite long before Judith Butler and her idea of gender performativity, but very similar idea here, expressed by de Beauvoir. You are born into the world, and then culture forms you into your gender. So you can be born female, but it takes enculturation to become a woman. So it's not an inborn thing. You need to learn it. You need to learn it through culture. Then we have 4 more names here of the intellectuals, mostly American intellectuals, from the second half of the 20th century. The first one is Betty Friedan, and her most important book called The Feminine Mystique from 1963. So it's about the post-war American society of relatively wealthy middle-class homes living in the suburbs, so very strictly defined gender roles, like the ones you could see in those old advertisements and old illustrations, with the men going out to work and providing for the family, and the woman as a homemaker basically spending her entire day in the home in the suburbs, cleaning and cooking and looking after children, and basically looking pretty for the man who returns to the home after work. And for Betty Friedan, this was something that was supposed to be an ideal environment for women, but in reality, many of these American suburban housewives were depressed and they felt trapped and unhappy. And in her book, she talks with them, and she basically unmasks this idealized image of the happy American suburban families. The next intellectual from the second wave of feminism was Germaine Greer, and her most important book is called The Female Eunuch from 1970. Eunuch is a castrated man, she presents traditional suburban consumerist nuclear family as an oppressive institution that dehumanizes women. They are like dehumanized. They're neither women nor men. They are like castrated men, castrated of their potential. Normal, in inverted commas, femininity for Germaine Greer is basically full of stereotypes. She was also American. She was talking about American culture. She believed women should not accept it. She believed there were no biological differences between male and female brains. This is sometimes contested, but I think it's relevant today. So Germaine Greer and The Female Eunuch as the voice against the dehumanization of women in traditional American social life. The whole idea about biological differences between male and female brains is sometimes still contested. I would say it's still an open question to science. Possibly there are some biological differences, but perhaps not to the point to explain the vast cultural differences imposed on men and women. In 1999, Germaine Greer wrote another book called The Whole Woman, in which she basically observed quite pessimistically that not much has changed in the 30 years when her first book was published. Two more names today, the names connected more with the third wave of feminism. So the first one is Naomi Wolf and her book The Beauty Myth from 1991, and she devotes the entire book to the study of the beauty industry, and American mostly, beauty industry and the ideal of feminine beauty, which she again identifies as an oppressive social construct. For her, this is an example of social hegemony controlled by patriarchy. So let's unpack it. Hegemony is the term borrowed from an Italian anti-fascist early 20th century philosopher called Antonio Gramsci. We are going to meet him again, so you'll see the name spelled out. And he observed that in the society he lived in, that is the fascist society in Italy, the society ruled by Mussolini, it's not only the physical violence, the threat of violence that allows the ruling forces to dominate the society, but also some sort of cultural dominance, which he called hegemony. And this term became very popular among the left-wing intellectuals ever since. So this is more of the kind of Marx derived side of culture and literature studies. So more materialist culture. So in this case, for Naomi Wolf, the beauty industry is an example of social hegemony, so the imposition of values and belief systems of the dominant social group, in this case the men in power, the patriarchy, which means the men in power in the society. And she observed that women are made to aspire to unattainable beauty standards because this distracts them from more important issues. So rather than, I don't know, campaign for equal pay for equal jobs or any other social relevant issues, they are encouraged and instructed to obsess about, I don't know, the size of their breasts and dieting and the hair and makeup and fashion and all the other elements of physical attractiveness. She believed this caused a lot of damage to women individually on the psychological level, through promoting eating disorders and excessive, unnecessary cosmetic surgery. But this was a kind of cultural phenomenon that, in her view, was aiming at precisely distracting women from noticing bigger problems in life. So you may think about that. The last name today is another intellectual from the 90s, the book from the 90s by Susan Faludi. The book was entitled Backlash, the Undeclared War Against American Women. And this is the book about, a very interesting book, about the American popular culture of the 1980s. So the Ronald Reagan presidency and the conservative reaction against women's rights, especially in popular culture, so in television, in film, in popular magazines. So she observed and discussed the stereotypes spread against women, especially the women who wanted to have professional careers, who are ambitious and who are not really family oriented as the stereotypes would have it. So she believed that popular culture in the 80s, so she was writing this at the beginning of the 90s, still perpetuated the conservative worldview that women's place is in the home, so looking after children, looking after the husband. And next week we will start with talking about other ways, other than feminism and generally women's issues, that culture deals with the questions of human body. So we'll start with that and we'll continue with the discussion of family life. Thank you.